The cold in Ohio in mid-November doesn't just chill your skin. It settles deep into your bones, aching in places you didn't even know you had. I pulled the collar of my heavy brown khaki jacket tighter around my neck, trying to trap whatever body heat was left inside my light brown turtleneck. The engine of my old Chevy Malibu had been off for 3 hours to save gas, and the frost was already creeping up the edges of the windshield like crystalline spider webs. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face staring back at me wasn't someone you'd look twice at, just an everyday woman, a 68-year-old retired middle school history teacher with tired eyes and graying hair. My earlobes were completely bare, stung by the freezing air in the cabin. I hadn't worn earrings or any kind of jewelry in weeks. What was the point of dressing up for a Walmart parking lot at 2 a.m? A sharp tap on the passenger side window made my heart hammer against my ribs. I turned, instinctively pulling my coat tighter. Outside, shivering in the harsh fluorescent glow of the parking lot lights, stood a woman who looked to be in her 50s. She wasn't a security guard. She was holding a steaming paper cup from the 24-hour diner across the street. I cracked the window down just an inch. "I've seen your car here the last 3 nights, the woman said, her voice muffled by a thick wool scarf. "I'm not trying to pry, ma'am. I couldn't go home to my warm bed knowing someone was out here. It's black coffee, 2 sugars. She didn't wait for me to explain myself. She didn't look at me with pity. She just set the cup gently on the hood of the Chevy, offered a small, understanding nod, and walked away into the freezing dark. I rolled the window down, reached out with trembling, stiff fingers, and brought the cup inside. The heat radiating through the cheap cardboard felt like a miracle, and as the first sip of bitter, scalding coffee hit my tongue, something inside me finally broke. I leaned my forehead against the freezing steering wheel and wept, not out of self-pity, but out of the sheer, devastating shock of human kindness. It had been so long since someone had looked at me and actually seen a human being. As I sat there in this dark, my tears cooling on my cheeks, the same question I had asked myself 100 times echoed in my mind. How did I get here? I am not an addict. I am not a gambler. I was a woman who had stood in a classroom for 30 years teaching children about the American Revolution. I was a woman who had built a life, a family, and a home. I had a husband who loved me. I had a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, completely paid off and worth over $600,000. And I have a son, David. To understand the freezing reality of this parking lot, you have to understand the warmth of the life I lost. And to understand that, we have to go back 2 years. Back to the day the foundation of my world crumbled. My husband, Arthur Hayes, was a quiet man. He was a structural engineer, a man who believed that everything in life, bridges, buildings, and marriages, required a solid foundation. He was meticulous, careful with his words, and absolute in his devotion to me. We were married for 41 years. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Arthur went out to the garden to prune the hydrangeas, sat down on the wooden bench he had built himself, and simply closed his eyes. The doctors said it was a massive cardiac arrest. Painless, they promised. But the pain didn't die with him, it just transferred to me. The weeks following Arthur's funeral are a blur of casseroles from neighbors I barely knew and the suffocating silence of an empty house. Every room smelled like his aftershave. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like his footsteps. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum dedicated to a life that was over. That was when David stepped in. David, my only child. He lived a few hours away in Cincinnati with his wife, Jessica, and my 8-year-old grandson, Tyler. In those dark weeks, David was everything Arthur would have wanted him to be. He drove up every weekend. He made sure I ate. He held my hand while I cried. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table sorting through Arthur's endless files, David reached over and placed his hand over mine. "Mom," he said softly, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "I hate leaving you here. You shouldn't be alone in this big house with all these memories. It's eating you alive." "I don't know what else to do, Davy," I whispered, using his childhood nickname. "Come live with us," he said. The offer hung in the air, warm and inviting. "Tyler misses his grandma. Jess and I have that big guest room on the first floor. You can garden in the backyard, help Tyler with his history homework. You won't be alone." It sounded like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But the house... I hesitated, looking around at the walls that held 4 decades of my life. "We sell it," David said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "The market is peaking right now, Mom. The realtor said we could easily get $600,000 for it. We'll take that money and put it into a joint investment account. I'll manage it for you. It'll be your nest egg, your retirement fund. You won't ever have to worry about property taxes or a leaking roof ever again. I want to pause here. If you are listening to this, and you are of a certain age, I know exactly what you are screaming at the screen right now. Don't do it. Keep your name on your assets. Don't sign away your independence. And you are right, but grief is a heavy, dark blanket that smothers your common sense. When you have just buried the man who handled all the practicalities of your life for 40 years, the idea of managing a real estate sale, property taxes, and investment portfolios feels like trying to climb a mountain with no oxygen. I just wanted to rest. I trusted my son. I had rocked him to sleep when he had a fever. I had paid for his college. Why wouldn't I trust him? So I signed. I signed the deed. I signed the power of attorney. The house sold for $615,000. I watched David slide the cashier's check across the desk at the bank, depositing it into an account that had both our names on it. "I've got you, Mom," David had smiled, kissing my cheek as we walked out of the bank. "You're safe now." I packed my clothes, my favorite books, and a small lockbox of Arthur's personal keepsakes. I left the Columbus house behind and rode with David to Cincinnati, watching the scenery change through the passenger window. I thought I was moving into a sanctuary, a warm embrace of family for my twilight years. I didn't realize I had just financed my own cage, and I certainly didn't know that my daughter-in-law Jessica was waiting at the door, holding the key to lock it. The house in Cincinnati was immaculate. It was a sprawling, modern colonial with a manicured lawn, an open-concept kitchen that looked like a magazine spread, and a front door painted a trendy, stark charcoal. When David first carried my bags across that threshold, Tyler had rushed at my legs, nearly knocking me over with the sheer, unbridled force of an 8-year-old's hug. For the first few weeks, I let myself believe I had made the right choice. I told myself that the dull ache in my chest was just Arthur's absence, not the environment. I had my own room on the first floor, a suite, David called it, though it was really just a repurposed home office with a view of the neighbor's vinyl fence. Still, it had a bed, a small dresser, and a door I could close. I tried to earn my keep. I am a woman who worked her entire adult life. I don't know how to exist in a space without contributing to it. So I started cooking dinner 3 nights a week. I did the laundry. I waited at the bus stop for Tyler every afternoon. I thought I was weaving myself into the fabric of their household, becoming an essential, helpful thread. But Jessica had a different vision for her home. Jess owned a boutique downtown. She was a woman built on aesthetics, a curator of appearances. Her life was a meticulously arranged display window, and she possessed a terrifying instinct for control. She didn't yell, at least not at first. She managed me the same way she managed the mannequins in her shop, through small, precise, unrelenting corrections. It started in the kitchen. I had spent 40 years making a marriage work through compromise and grace, but Jess did not view her kitchen as a place for compromise. "Oh, Bea," she sighed one morning, stepping lightly across the hardwood floor. She gently, but firmly, took the wooden spoon out of my hand. "We don't use wood on the Le Creuset pans. It holds bacteria. And the spices, I had them alphabetized. You put the cinnamon next to the cumin." "I'm sorry, dear," I said, stepping back, suddenly feeling too large and clumsy for the room. "I'll remember next time." But there was always a next time, and a new rule. The dishwasher had to be loaded according to a geometric logic I could never master. The throw pillows on the living room sofa had to be chopped perfectly in the center, and my habit of sitting on them to read meant I was constantly ruining her lines. My coffee cup could not be left on the counter for more than 5 minutes lest it create visual clutter. Every day, a new correction. Every day, a tiny chip taken out of my confidence. It is a profound, quiet violence to make an adult woman feel like a toddler who cannot be trusted with a ceramic plate. I was being slowly, methodically erased. The turning point, the moment I realized I wasn't family, but an aesthetic liability, happened on a Sunday morning in late September. Jess was hosting a brunch for a few women from her boutique's neighborhood association. I had spent the early morning quietly prepping a fruit salad and baking a quiche, trying to stay out of her way. By 10 o'clock, the doorbell was ringing, and the house filled with the sharp, trilling laughter of women holding mimosas. I had gone to my room to freshen up before joining them. I dressed for comfort, wearing a simple, everyday beige cardigan layered over a light beige t-shirt. I had left my hair loose, falling in soft, relaxed waves rather than the tight, structured styling I used to maintain for parent-teacher conferences. I wore no jewelry. It was modest. It was quiet. It was me. When I walked out into the living room to offer around the platter of quiche, the conversation dipped. Jess caught my eye from across the kitchen island. Her smile tightened, her eyes doing a swift, cold inventory of my appearance from the hem of my slacks to the collar of my sweater. She excused herself from her friends, intercepted me in the hallway, and placed a manicured hand on my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly tight. "B," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "What are you wearing?" I looked down at myself, confused. "My beige cardigan. Is there a stain?" "No, it's not a stain," she said, her eyes flashing with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. "It's just so drab. You look like you're going to garden. These are important clients, B. This is my home, and I try to maintain a certain standard. If you're going to mingle, could you at least put on a structured blouse? Or maybe just stay in the den with Tyler? He's watching cartoons." She didn't wait for my answer. She took the platter of quiche from my hands and glided back to her guests, a radiant, perfect hostess. I stood in the hallway, my cheeks burning with a hot, humiliating flush. I looked down at my simple beige sleeves. There was nothing wrong with my clothes. What was wrong was me. I was a reminder of age, of messiness, of things that couldn't be perfectly curated. I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room. I retreated to the den and sat in the dark with my grandson. I didn't come out for the rest of the day. That evening, I finally spoke to David. I waited until Jess was upstairs drawing a bath. David was sitting at the kitchen island, his laptop open, scrolling through spreadsheets, looking exhausted and gray. "David," I said quietly, taking the stool next to him, "we need to talk about how Jess speaks to me." He didn't look up from his screen. He just massaged his temples. "Mom, please, not tonight. She asked me to hide in the den today because of my sweater," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I sold my home. I gave you the money. I feel like a ghost here, Davy. I'm just asking for a little respect." David finally stopped typing. He closed his laptop with a heavy sigh and looked at me. But I didn't see the son who had held my hand at his father's funeral. I saw a man drowning in his own life, desperate for a raft. "Mom, Jess is under a lot of pressure right now," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth I used to rely on. "The boutique isn't hitting its numbers. She's stressed. You being here, it's an adjustment for her, for all of us. So I have to adjust to being treated like an eyesore?" David reached out and patted my hand, a dismissive, perfunctory gesture. "Just try to blend in, Mom. Please, don't make waves. Just keep the peace." He stood up, grabbed his laptop, and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the pristine, silent kitchen. I sat there for a long time, staring at the perfect, spotless countertops. I realized then that David was never going to protect me. He had chosen his peace over my dignity. I had traded the sanctuary of a 60-year-old life for a golden cage, and my own son had handed over the padlock. What I didn't know yet, what I would discover just a few days later, lingering in the hallway outside their home office, was why David was so terrified of upsetting Jess. The truth about the boutique's pressure was far darker, and the money I thought was safely tucked away for my retirement was already gone. When you are an older woman living in someone else's house, you learn the art of invisibility. You learn which floorboards creak and how to avoid them. You learn to match the rhythm of your breathing to the hum of the refrigerator. You learn to occupy as little physical and emotional space as humanly possible. By late October, I had become a master of being unseen. I spent my days reading in the small guest room or walking to the neighborhood park just to be out of Jessica's sightline. I had convinced myself that this was simply the price of family. I was paying for proximity to my grandson Tyler. I was paying for the illusion that I was not alone in the world. I didn't know I had already paid with everything I owned. It was a Tuesday evening. A heavy, relentless autumn rain was beating against the windows, the kind of rain that makes a house feel like a sealed ship. Tyler was upstairs, deeply asleep after soccer practice. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm outside and the low, tense murmur of voices coming from David and Jessica's home office down the hall. Normally, I would have walked past without a second thought. I had no interest in their marital disagreements. But as I carried a small basket of folded laundry toward the linen closet, the tone of Jessica's voice caught me. It wasn't her usual sharp, commanding tone. It was shrill, desperate. It was the sound of a woman backed into a corner. "You don't understand, David," she hissed. Even through the heavy oak door, which was left open just a crack, her panic was palpable. "The vendors are cutting me off. The fall inventory hasn't been paid for. If I don't wire $40,000 by Friday, they are going to file a lien. The boutique will be finished." I stopped in my tracks. My hand hovered over the brass knob of the linen closet. $40,000? Just a few weeks ago, at that brunch, she had boasted to her friends about expanding her shop into the adjacent retail space. "Jess, I can't." David's voice was a low, ragged groan. It was the sound of a man who had not slept peacefully in months. "I literally cannot do it. There is nothing left." "Pull it from the home equity line," she demanded, her voice rising. "Or take another loan against your 401k. I already maxed out the HELOC to pay off your spring collection debt. And my 401k is tapped out from the store's renovation last year," David shot back. The desperation in his voice made my chest tighten. "I'm drowning here, Jess. I am drowning to keep your aesthetic afloat." "Don't you dare put this all on me," she snapped, her words dripping with venom. "This is a partnership. My boutique is our future." "It's a black hole!" David's voice finally cracked, breaking the whisper barrier. "It has sucked up every single cent we have. I have nothing else to give you. What about your mother's account?" The mention of my name froze the blood in my veins. The laundry basket in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as lead. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I pressed myself flat against the hallway wall, listening to the silence that followed her question. "Jess," David whispered, and the profound shame in that single syllable told me everything I needed to know before he even finished the sentence. "Jess, it's gone." "What do you mean it's gone?" "There has to be a buffer." "I mean it is gone," David said, his voice breaking into a suppressed sob. "The $615,000. The house money. The joint investment account. It's all gone. I used the last $80,000 2 months ago to pay off your secret business credit cards before the bank started foreclosure proceedings on this house." I closed my eyes. The hallway spun around me. The smell of Jessica's expensive eucalyptus diffuser suddenly made me violently nauseous. $615,000. In my mind's eye, I saw Arthur. I saw my husband coming home from the engineering firm at 7 o'clock at night, his boots covered in dust, his hands calloused. I saw him sitting at our kitchen table in Columbus with a cheap calculator, carefully budgeting our groceries so we could pay off our mortgage 5 years early. I saw 40 years of his sweat, his sacrifice, his fierce protection of our future. And in 18 months, my son had handed it all to a woman who thought a beige sweater was an insult to her living room. "Well?" Jessica said. Her voice didn't soften. There was no gasp of horror. There was no apology for destroying an old woman's life savings. Instead, her tone became icy, calculating, and ruthlessly pragmatic. "It was an investment in the family. She lives here for free, David. She eats our food. She uses our utilities. If the store goes under, we lose this house, and then where would she go? She owes us. It's the least she could do." "She thinks that money is sitting in a Vanguard index fund, Jess," David cried softly. "She asked me about the quarterly statement last week, and I had to lie to her face. Again." "So you keep lying," Jessica replied, her voice as smooth and hard as polished stone. "You manage her. Tell her the market is down. Tell her it's tied up in long-term bonds. She's almost 70, David. She doesn't understand modern finance. She'll believe whatever you tell her as long as you say it nicely." I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. I couldn't. My hands were trembling so violently that I had to set the laundry basket down on the carpet to keep from dropping it. I backed away from the door, step by agonizingly slow step, terrified that a creaking floorboard would alert them to my presence. I made it back to my small room and shut the door without making a sound. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, staring blankly at the vinyl fence outside my window, illuminated by a neighbor's floodlight through the pouring rain. The physical sensation of betrayal is impossible to describe unless you have felt it. It doesn't break your heart. It hollows it out. It leaves a gaping, freezing void in the center of your chest where your trust used to live. I had traded my home, my independence, and my husband's legacy for a lie. I thought back to every time David had patted my hand, every time he had said, "I've got you, Mom. You're safe." Every time he had looked into my eyes and smoothly, effortlessly deceived me. He hadn't brought me here to take care of me. He had brought me here to harvest me. I was just a walking ATM, a desperate solution to his wife's vanity and his own cowardice. And Jessica, the audacity of her cold calculation. She lives here for free. She owes us. I looked around the small beige room. My suite. I was trapped. I had no house to return to. I had no money to rent an apartment. My pension as a retired teacher was barely enough to cover a week's groceries and my medications. I was financially tethered to two people who had stripped me down to the bone and were now complaining that I was taking up space. A wave of panic, raw and primal, washed over me. I gasped for air, clutching my chest as the room seemed to shrink. I felt exactly like an animal that had just realized the door to the trap had snapped shut. But as the panic subsided, leaving me exhausted and hollow, something else began to take root in the dark, quiet corners of my mind. It wasn't the grief I had carried since Arthur's death. It wasn't the fear of being alone. It was a cold, hard, clarifying anger. I was Beatrice Hayes. I had survived cancer in my 40s. I had raised a child. I had buried the love of my life. I was not a foolish, helpless old woman who didn't understand modern finance. I was a mother who had just been robbed by her own flesh and blood. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair by the window, watching the rain turn to a miserable, freezing drizzle. I knew I couldn't just pack my bags and walk out into the storm. I had nowhere to go. I had to be smart. I had to force David to look me in the eye and confess what he had done. The next morning, I wouldn't be the invisible, accommodating grandmother. I was going to demand the truth, even if it shattered whatever illusion of a family we had left. The morning after my discovery did not announce itself with thunder or lightning. It crept in with a pale, gray light that filtered through the vinyl blinds of my small room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I hadn't slept a single minute. I felt fragile, as if my bones had been replaced by hollow glass, but my mind possessed a terrifying, crystal-clear sharpness. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, steady resolve. I was a history teacher. I had spent 30 years studying wars, treaties, and the subtle, quiet moments before empires collapsed. I knew that the greatest battles were rarely fought with shouting. They were fought in the silences. At 7:30 a.m., the house went through its usual meticulously choreographed routine. Jessica clip-clopped downstairs in her designer heels, smelling of expensive perfume and espresso. She gave me her standard, tight-lipped smile, a smile I now knew was funded by my stolen life savings, grabbed her keys, and drove off to the boutique. 15 minutes later, the yellow school bus swallowed Tyler up at the end of the cul-de-sac. The house fell completely, suffocatingly silent. David was working from home that day. I could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard coming from the study down the hall. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my simple beige cardigan. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the plush runner rug, and stood in the doorway of his office. David was hunched over his mahogany desk, staring intensely at two glowing monitors. He looked awful. The skin under his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, and his posture was that of a man carrying a physical boulder on his shoulders. For a fleeting second, the mother in me wanted to ask him if he was eating enough. But the woman who had been robbed of $615,000 silenced her. "David," I said. My voice was calm, level, and entirely devoid of its usual maternal warmth. It was my teacher's voice, the one I used when a student was caught in a lie, and I was waiting for them to confess. He jumped slightly, spinning around in his leather chair. "Mom, you startled me. What's up? Is the Wi-Fi acting up again?" "Close the door, Davy." His hands hovered over the keyboard. A flicker of something, apprehension, maybe fear, crossed his features before he quickly masked it with a tired smile. "I'm actually right in the middle of a quarterly report for regional." "Close the door," I repeated, not raising my volume, but hardening the edges of every consonant. He swallowed hard, stood up, and gently pushed the heavy oak door shut until it clicked. He leaned against it, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. "Okay, what's going on? You look pale." I didn't sit down. I wanted to look him in the eye from the same height. "I want the statement for the joint Vanguard account. I want the login credentials, the account numbers, and the current balance. Right now." David's face performed a masterful, desperate act of confused innocence. He let out a breathless little chuckle, shaking his head. "Mom, we talked about this. The market is in a weird place right now, and the portal has been migrating servers. It's complicated. I'm managing it." "Stop." I held up a single hand. "Just stop, David." He froze. "I didn't sleep last night," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Because I was standing in the hallway when Jessica came home. I stood right outside this door. I heard her screaming about the vendors. I heard her asking for $40,000. The blood completely drained from David's face. He looked as though I had just struck him with a physical blow. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that wouldn't come. And I heard you tell her, I continued, stepping closer to him, refusing to let him look away, that you used the last $80,000 of my money to pay off her secret credit cards to save this house from foreclosure. I heard you say it was all gone, every single cent of the house your father built. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the computer tower. Then my son, my only child, the boy I had rocked through fevers and carried through thunderstorms, crumbled. He didn't just cry, he collapsed inward. He sank into one of the guest chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands, and let out a wretched, guttural sob. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words muffled by his fingers. "Mom, I am so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear to God I didn't." I stood over him, waiting for the maternal instinct to kick in. I waited to feel the urge to pull his head to my chest and tell him that everything would be all right. But the well was dry. I felt nothing but a profound, chilling disgust. "Where did it go, David?" I asked, my voice devoid of pity. "How do you burn through over $600,000 in 18 months? He looked up at me, his eyes red and leaking. He looked pathetic. "It was the boutique. Jess, she has this vision. She wanted to expand. But the foot traffic died down and the inventory wasn't moving. She took out loans she didn't tell me about. High-interest, predatory stuff. By the time I found out, they were threatening to put a lien on our house. Tyler's home, Mom." He reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled it back, stepping out of his reach. "So you stole from your widowed mother to finance your wife's vanity project?" I asked, laying the reality bare. "I didn't steal it," he pleaded, panic rising in his chest. "I borrowed it. I thought if I could just get the boutique in the black, I could pay the account back with interest before you ever needed it. I was trying to save my marriage, Mom. Jess was threatening to leave and take Tyler. I was drowning. You have to understand, I was drowning. And to save yourself, you pulled me under." David slumped forward, defeated. Yes, I did. "So what happens now?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Are you going to tell her that I know? Are you going to go to the police and report your own embezzlement? Because that's what this is, David. Fraud." "No, Mom, please." David scrambled to his feet, sheer terror wiping away his tears. He clasped his hands together like a beggar. "Please, you can't say anything to Jess. If she knows that you know, she'll blow this whole house up. She's already on the edge. She'll divorce me. She'll take Tyler to her sisters in California, and I will lose everything. My son, my house, my life." I stared at him, my heart turning to ash. "He will lose everything." Not a single word about what I had lost. Not a single thought about the fact that a 68-year-old woman was now entirely destitute, financially tethered to a sinking ship. He wasn't crying because he had betrayed Arthur's memory or ruined my life. He was crying because he was terrified of his wife. He was the ultimate coward. "What am I supposed to do, David?" I asked softly. "I have no money. I have nowhere to go. Jessica treats me like a piece of garbage that she hasn't gotten around to taking to the curb yet. She poured my coffee down the sink yesterday because I left the mug on the counter. Am I just supposed to smile and play the grateful grandmother while she wears my retirement fund on her feet? Just give me time," David begged, his eyes wide, desperate. "I'm looking for a second job. I'm trying to sell some of the equity. I will make you whole, Mom. I swear it on Dad's grave. Just keep the peace. For Tyler. Please, think of Tyler. If this house falls apart, his life is ruined." Think of Tyler. It was the ultimate emotional blackmail, and the tragedy of it was that it worked. I looked at the framed photograph on David's desk. It was a picture of Tyler and me, taken last Christmas. Tyler was missing his 2 front teeth, grinning wildly, his arms wrapped tight around my neck. He was the only innocent thing in this entire suffocating house. He was the only piece of Arthur's legacy that still had a heartbeat. If I called a lawyer today, if I exposed David's fraud, the collateral damage would be catastrophic. Jessica would undoubtedly take Tyler away out of spite. The house would be sold to pay off debts, and I would be thrown out onto the street with nothing but a legal victory I couldn't afford to enforce. I would lose my grandson. Forever. I looked back at the pathetic, broken man cowering before me. I realized that the son I had raised was gone. In his place was a hostage, suffering from a severe case of Stockholm Syndrome, willing to sacrifice his own mother to appease his captor. "All right," I said slowly. The word tasted like poison. David let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. "Thank you, Mom. Oh, God, thank you. I promise." "Do not promise me anything." I cut him off, my voice slicing through the air like a razor. "I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because my grandson deserves a roof over his head. But understand this, David." I stepped right up to him, so close he could see every wrinkle, every line of grief etched into my face. "I am not your mother anymore. Not really. And you are no longer the man your father raised. We are just two strangers living in a house built on lies. I will stay quiet. I will keep your secret. But I will never, ever forgive you." I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, not looking back as I heard him sink back into his chair, weeping silently into the void. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I had agreed to a silent complicity. I was now a prisoner who knew the exact dimensions of her cell. I had chosen to endure the unendurable for the sake of a child. But as I sat there, staring at the blank wall, the cold, hard anger from the night before did not fade. It crystallized. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew with absolute certainty that Jessica and David's house of cards was going to collapse. And until that day came, I was going to survive. Today là fan năm, the Thanksgiving eviction. Bidoy ngày lễ tạ ơn. Phần này là đỉnh điểm căng thẳng đầu tiên, climax 1 của câu chuyện, nơi chiếc mặt nạ của Jessica hoàn toàn rơi xuống, và sự hèn nhát của David chạm đến đáy. November dragged on like a slow-moving glacier. The 4 weeks following my confrontation with David were the most suffocating of my life. The house had become a theater, and we were all playing our parts in a grotesque tragedy. David played the exhausted, overworked husband, avoiding my eyes at all costs. I played the quiet, invisible ghost, swallowing my pride every single day so that I wouldn't trigger an explosion that would cost me my grandson. And Jessica? Jessica played the queen. She seemed to sense David's heightened anxiety, even if she didn't know its true cause, and she capitalized on it. Her demands became sharper, her criticisms louder. The silent complicity I had agreed to was eroding my soul, piece by piece. Then came Thanksgiving. In the Hayes household, Thanksgiving wasn't a time for gratitude. It was an aesthetic performance. Jessica had invited 24 people, investors for her boutique, affluent clients, and her own pretentious friends. The house had been scrubbed, decorated, and curated to look like a spread in Architectural Digest. The air was thick with the rich, warm smells of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and simmering cranberries. It was Thursday morning, 4 hours before the guests were scheduled to arrive. Tyler was in the den playing video games, blissfully unaware of the tension vibrating through the walls. I was desperately trying to stay out of Jessica's way, so I retreated to the laundry room to wash the linens from the guest bathroom. I found a small pile of clothes left on the floor near the hamper. Assuming they were just everyday items, I gathered them up and placed them into the washing machine. It was a mistake. A simple, honest, catastrophic mistake. Hidden inside that pile was an emerald green, imported Italian silk blouse. It was the centerpiece of the outfit Jessica had specifically bought to wear for the dinner, a garment that cost more than a month of my pension, and one that strictly required dry cleaning. When the cycle finished and I pulled the tangled knot of wet clothes from the drum, my heart dropped into my stomach. The beautiful emerald silk had shrunk, warped, and bled its dark green dye onto the other towels. The fabric was ruined beyond repair. I stood there, staring at the crumpled mess in my trembling hands, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Before I could even formulate a plan, the laundry room door swung open. Jessica stood there, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, holding an empty hanger. She froze, her eyes locking onto the dark green fabric in my hands. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the polished, passive-aggressive facade she had maintained for months shattered entirely. "What did you do?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, vibrating frequency. "Jess, I am so sorry," I stammered, my chest tightening. "It was on the floor with the towels. I didn't check the labels. I just thought—" "You thought?" Jessica screamed. The sudden volume was like a physical blow. She lunged forward, snatching the ruined silk from my hands. "You thought? You stupid, incompetent old woman. This is an $800 blouse. I'll pay for it, I said quickly, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth, knowing full well her husband had drained my bank account of every penny. I'll replace it. With what? Jessica shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The venom she had been holding back for a year finally spilled over. With what money, Bea? You don't have anything. You sit in my house, eating my food, using my electricity, ruining my things. You are a parasite. The word hung in the air, sharp and brutal. Parasite. Jessica, please, I said, my own voice trembling with an anger I was struggling to contain. Lower your voice. Tyler is in the next room. Don't you dare tell me how to speak in my own house, she roared, stepping into my personal space. I am sick of you. I am sick of your drab clothes, your pathetic lingering in the hallways, your constant presence. You contribute nothing. You are a burden. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. David rushed into the laundry room, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically between his screaming wife and his trembling mother. Jess, what's going on? What happened? David asked, his voice panicked. Jessica whirled around, shoving the ruined clump of silk into David's chest. Look at what she did. She ruined my clothes. But it's not just the blouse, David. It's her. I cannot breathe in this house anymore. I feel like a guest in my own home. Jess, calm down. It's just a shirt, David started, raising his hands defensively. It is not just a shirt. Jessica cut him off, her eyes blazing with a terrifying finality. I am done. Do you hear me, David? I am entirely, completely done. I cannot have her here anymore. She didn't wait for David to respond. She turned on her heel, stormed past us, and marched straight toward my bedroom. Jess, wait! What are you doing? David called out, jogging after her. I followed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When I reached the doorway of my room, I watched in horror as Jessica grabbed my archive bag, the sturdy leather suitcase Arthur had bought me for our 20th anniversary. She yanked it off the top shelf of the closet, hauled it to the bed, and began violently throwing my clothes, my toiletries, and my few remaining books into it. Jessica, stop! I demanded, finally raising my voice. She ignored me. She zipped the suitcase with a sharp, angry pull, grabbed the handle, and dragged it out of the room. The wheels scratched loudly against her precious hardwood floors. She hauled it down the hallway, opened the heavy charcoal front door, and with one massive heave, threw my suitcase out onto the snow-covered porch. A blast of freezing November wind whipped into the warm house, bringing with it the biting sting of reality. Get out! Jessica spat, pointing a manicured finger at the open door. Get out of my house. I stood frozen in the hallway. I looked at the dark gray sky, the snow swirling violently on the porch, and then I turned to my son. David was standing against the wall. His face was a mask of sheer terror. This was the moment. This was the moment a son was supposed to step between his mother and the cold. This was the moment he was supposed to defend the woman who had given him life, the woman whose financial ruin he had orchestrated. David, I whispered, my voice breaking. Please. David looked at me. Then he looked at Jessica, whose chest was heaving with fury. He knew that if he crossed her now, if he fought for me, she would tear their marriage apart, and his embezzlement would be exposed. He did the math in his head, weighing his mother's survival against his own. He looked down at his shoes. Mom, he muttered, his voice so quiet, so devoid of a spine, that it barely registered over the howling wind outside. Maybe it's best if you just go. What? I gasped, the single syllable tearing from my throat like a sob. Just for a little while, he pleaded to the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and with trembling hands retrieved a small stack of cash. He walked over and pressed it into my hand. This is all I have left from the account, he whispered, so quietly Jessica couldn't hear. It's $4,200. Take it. Get a motel on the interstate. Just let her cool down. We'll figure it out later. I looked down at the money in my hand. $4,200. The pathetic, miserable remnants of a $600,000 home. The final payment for a 40-year marriage. I looked back up at David. I saw him clearly for the very first time. He wasn't a victim of his wife's vanity. He was a willing participant in his own moral bankruptcy. I didn't cry. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside my chest. I straightened my back, pulling my beige cardigan tight around my shoulders. I did not look at Jessica. She did not exist to me anymore. You are not your father's son, I said to David. My voice was eerily calm, possessing the heavy, absolute finality of a judge passing a sentence. Arthur would be deeply ashamed of the man standing in front of me. David flinched as if I had struck him, a tear finally escaping his eye and rolling down his cheek. But I didn't stay to watch him weep. I turned around, stepped out into the freezing Ohio wind, and walked toward my suitcase. Behind me, the heavy wooden door slammed shut, the deadbolt clicking into place with a sharp metallic thud. The warm smell of the Thanksgiving turkey was instantly replaced by the biting scent of snow and exhaust. I picked up my suitcase, the leather handle cold against my bare hand. I walked down the driveway to my old Chevy Malibu, the snow crunching loudly under my thin shoes. I put the suitcase in the back seat, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I didn't look back at the house. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the neighborhood, driving aimlessly toward the highway. A 68-year-old woman with a half-empty tank of gas, $4,000 in her pocket, and a heart that had finally stopped breaking and started turning to ice. The descent into homelessness does not happen like a dramatic plunge off a cliff. For an older woman, it is a slow, humiliating slide down a muddy hill, where every frantic attempt to grab onto a root or a rock only leaves you with dirty, bruised hands. The $4,200 David had pressed into my palm felt like a fortune when I first drove away from that house on Thanksgiving Day. But the reality of America's housing market quickly taught me how worthless it truly was. I spent the first 3 nights in a roadside motel off Interstate 71. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial bleach, but it had a lock on the door and a heater that rattled but worked. I sat on the edge of that sagging mattress, my laptop open, trying to find an apartment. That is when the true, paralyzing panic set in. Every affordable complex required a credit check, a proof of income equal to 3 times the monthly rent, and a substantial security deposit. My teacher's pension barely covered 1 month's rent, let alone 3. I had no recent rental history because I had owned my home for 40 years. When I called the leasing offices and explained my situation, their voices would fill with that polite, detached corporate pity before they told me they couldn't approve my application. By the 4th morning, I realized that if I stayed at the motel, my meager funds would vanish in a matter of weeks, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I had to conserve. So, I checked out. I drove to the massive, sprawling parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, parked my Chevy Malibu under a flickering amber street lamp, and turned off the engine. That was how my 11 days in the car began. If you have never slept in a sedan during an Ohio winter, let me explain the physics of it. The cold doesn't just surround you, it invades you. It seeps up through the floorboards and radiates from the glass. You learn to sleep in 2-hour increments, waking up shivering so violently that your teeth ache, forced to turn the engine on just long enough to thaw your toes before the gas gauge drops another agonizing millimeter. You learn the profound shame of washing your face and brushing your teeth in a fast food restaurant bathroom, hoping the teenage cashier doesn't notice you've worn the same beige cardigan for 4 days straight. You become a ghost. Society looks right through you, or worse, looks away in discomfort. By the 11th night, the night the kind stranger tapped on my window and handed me that scalding cup of black coffee, I was at the absolute end of my physical and spiritual endurance. After the woman walked away, leaving me weeping over the steering wheel, I took a long, burning sip of the coffee. The heat spread through my chest, thawing a tiny fraction of the despair. It gave me just enough clarity to realize a brutal truth. I could not survive another week like this. I was 68 years old. My joints were screaming, my back was locked in agony, and a persistent rattling cough had taken up residence in my lungs. I needed a real bed. I needed an extended stay motel, even if it meant draining the last of David's blood money. But to afford the deposit and still have enough for food, I needed just a little more cash. I reached over the center console and dragged my heavy leather archive bag from the back seat. Jessica had thrown it onto the porch with such violence that the zipper was permanently warped. Inside was a chaotic jumble of my life. A few sweaters, some undergarments, a photo album, and the small wooden lockbox of Arthur's personal keepsakes that I had taken from our Columbus house. I pulled the lockbox onto my lap. My hands were stiff and clumsy from the cold as I opened the brass latch. Inside were the small, seemingly valueless artifacts of a 40-year marriage. A pair of silver cufflinks, his reading glasses, a handful of old faded ticket stubs from our honeymoon, and resting at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel, was his pocket watch. It was a heavy silver Hamilton watch, beautifully engraved with intricate vines. It wasn't a family heirloom. Arthur had bought it for himself when he got his first major promotion at the engineering firm. He used to keep it on his desk, claiming the rhythmic, heavy ticking helped him think through complex structural equations. I held the cold silver in the palm of my hand, running my thumb over the smooth glass face. The hands were frozen at 3:15. It was a beautiful piece. A pawn shop downtown might give me $100 for it. Maybe $200 if the silver weight was good. The thought of trading Arthur's watch to a stranger in a pawn shop made my stomach turn. It felt like a final, irreversible defeat. It felt like selling the last piece of the man who had loved me. "I'm sorry, Arthur," I whispered to the empty, freezing car, my breath pluming in the air. "I don't know what else to do. I'm so sorry." I decided to clean it up, hoping to make it look as presentable as possible. I used the hem of my shirt to polish the silver casing. As I rubbed the back of the watch, applying a bit of pressure to remove a stubborn smudge of tarnish, my thumb caught on a microscopic groove near the hinge. I remembered Arthur mentioning once that the back of the watch could be removed to service the gears, but he had never done it in front of me. Out of sheer idle curiosity, or perhaps just a desperate desire to delay the inevitable trip to the pawn shop, I pressed my thumbnail into the tiny groove and pried upward. With a sharp metallic click, the silver backplate popped off into my palm. I expected to see a complex array of tiny brass gears, springs, and rubies. Instead, the entire back cavity of the watch had been hollowed out. The intricate mechanism was gone. In its place, folded tightly into a perfect, precise square, was a piece of translucent wax paper, and resting on top of the paper, glinting faintly in the amber light of the parking lot lamp, was a small, uniquely shaped brass key. My heart completely stopped. The ambient noise of the highway in the distance seemed to instantly vanish. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely pinch the tiny key. I lifted it out. It was heavy for its size, with a square head and a complex, jagged bite. It looked exactly like the key to a bank's safe deposit box. I set the key carefully on the dashboard. Then, holding my breath, I unfolded the delicate square of wax paper. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the handwriting. It was Arthur's. Precise, deliberate, engineering block letters, written in his favorite black fountain pen. The ink had not faded. The note was brief, but every single word landed like a thunderclap in the silent cabin of my car. "My dearest B, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the worst has happened. I am not there to protect you, and David has failed us. I always knew our son had a soft spine. I saw the way he deferred to Jessica's greed, the way he compromised his own morals for a quiet life. I hoped he would grow out of his cowardice when I passed, but an engineer never builds a bridge without a failsafe. You are my heart, B, and I would never leave you to the mercy of a woman who does not respect you, or a son who cannot defend you. Take the key. Go to the First National Bank on Broad Street in Columbus. Box 814. The account is under your maiden name. Trust no one, especially not David. Stand up, my love. They only have the power you let them keep. Forever yours, Arthur." I read the letter once. Then I read it again. And then a third time, tracing the sharp angles of his handwriting with my index finger, half convinced I was hallucinating from the cold and the exhaustion. An engineer never builds a bridge without a failsafe. A sound escaped my throat, a strange, jagged sound that was half sob and half laugh. It was the sound of a woman who had been buried alive, suddenly feeling the warm sunlight hit her face as the dirt was swept away. Arthur knew. My quiet, meticulous, brilliant husband had seen the cracks in David's character long before I had. He had seen Jessica's calculating nature. While I was busy playing the hopeful mother, trying to see the best in our son, Arthur was quietly, methodically building a fortress to protect me in case the whole structure collapsed. The betrayal I had suffered at David's hands had made me feel foolish and small. But this letter was a profound, absolute validation of my worth. Arthur had loved me enough to look into the ugliest parts of our family dynamic and plan for my survival. I looked at the brass key resting on the dashboard. Suddenly, the freezing temperature inside the Chevy Malibu didn't matter anymore. The ache in my back vanished. The humiliating memory of Jessica throwing my suitcase into the snow felt like something that had happened to a completely different, weaker person in a past life. I was not a helpless widow begging for scraps. I was Beatrice Hayes, and my husband had left me a weapon. I carefully folded the wax paper and placed it in my coat pocket, buttoning it securely. I picked up the brass key and clenched it in my fist, the sharp edges pressing into my palm, grounding me. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 4:15 a.m. The banks in Columbus wouldn't open for another 5 hours, and the drive would take me almost 2. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The old Chevy roared to life, the heater violently blowing cold air that would soon turn warm. I pulled the gear shift into drive, turned my headlights on, and pulled out of the Walmart parking lot, leaving the ghost of the terrified, broken woman I had been sitting in the empty space behind me. I was going home to Columbus, and I was going to find out exactly what kind of failsafe my husband had built. The 2-hour drive north on Interstate 71 from Cincinnati to Columbus felt less like a commute and more like crossing the border into another dimension. The sun finally crested over the frozen, barren Ohio fields, casting a pale, blinding light across the frost-covered windshield. I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. I was still wearing the same brown khaki jacket layered over a light brown turtleneck that I had slept in for days. But the exhausted, hollowed-out victim who had wept over a steering wheel was gone. In her place was someone entirely different. My face had settled into a resilient, firm, and steely expression, yet tempered with the gentle, terrifying patience of a teacher who knows exactly how a difficult lesson is going to end. I wasn't smiling. My eyes, staring down the long stretch of highway, held a soulful, awakened clarity. I was no longer a piece of misplaced furniture. I was a woman with a key. I pulled into downtown Columbus just as the city was waking up. First National Bank on Broad Street was an old, imposing limestone building, the kind of institution that practically radiated permanence and quiet power. I walked through the heavy brass doors exactly at 9 o'clock, the warmth of the lobby washing over my frozen limbs. A polished teller directed me to the vault manager. I handed him my driver's license and the small brass key. He didn't blink at my wrinkled clothes or my lack of makeup. He simply nodded, checked his ledger, and led me into the cavernous, quiet belly of the bank. Box 814. He left me alone in a small private viewing room with a heavy steel drawer resting on the mahogany table. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence of the vault settle into my bones, and lifted the lid. Part of me, the desperate, pragmatic part, had hoped to see stacks of $100 bills. But Arthur was an engineer, not a bank robber. The box was empty except for a thick, sealed manila envelope. I broke the seal. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper, and a single, crisp business card clipped to the front page. Patricia Rollins, attorney at law, estate planning and trust management. Next to her office number was a handwritten note from Arthur. Call Patty. She knows everything. I didn't wait. I used my cell phone right there in the quiet room. The phone rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. Patricia Rollins speaking. Ms. Rollins, I said, my voice remarkably steady. My name is Beatrice Hayes. My husband was... Arthur? Patty interrupted, her tone instantly softening, carrying a weight of profound relief. Beatrice, oh, thank God. I have been trying to locate you for over a year, but the letters I sent to the Columbus house were returned to sender, and I was strictly forbidden by Arthur's directives to contact David's address. Where are you right now? I'm at the First National Bank on Broad Street. I have his envelope. I am 3 blocks away, she said quickly. Come to my office immediately. I'll have hot tea waiting for you. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a plush leather chair in a corner office overlooking the Columbus skyline. Patty Rollins was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a sharp navy suit, her graying hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She radiated competence. She poured me a cup of Earl Grey tea, taking in my disheveled appearance without a single ounce of judgment, only a deep, knowing empathy. Arthur was the most meticulous client I have ever had the pleasure of working with, Patty began, taking her seat across the massive desk and opening an identical manila file. He came to me about 5 years ago to structure his estate. He loved you very much, Beatrice, but he was deeply, profoundly concerned about your son's financial vulnerability and his wife's, let's call it ambitious spending habits. I gripped the warm teacup. David took everything, Patty. The $600,000 from the house we sold. He used it to pay off Jessica's secret boutique debts. They threw me out on Thanksgiving. I've been sleeping in my car. Patty's eyes flared with a sharp, cold anger. She didn't gasp. She just nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Arthur anticipated a catastrophic failure of David's character. That is exactly why he built the failsafe. She slid a thick document across the desk toward me. The bold heading at the top read, The Arthur Hayes Irrevocable Trust. When Arthur set up this trust, he made you the sole undisputed beneficiary, Patty explained. her voice dropping into a precise legal cadence. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered, amended, or touched by anyone but the designated trustee, which is me, for the sole benefit of you. David has absolutely no legal standing, no claim, and no access to what is inside this trust. But what is inside it? I asked, looking at the dense legal jargon. David drained the joint bank account. I have $4,000 to my name. Beatrice, you have substantially more than that, Patty said, a faint, almost dangerous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Because the trust doesn't just hold Arthur's quiet long-term stock portfolio, which currently sits at about $300,000. I blinked, the number washing over me. $300,000. I wasn't destitute. I could rent an apartment. I could breathe. But that is not the most important asset, Patty continued, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine. She slid a second document across the desk. It was an operating agreement for a limited liability company called Foundation Properties, LLC. 7 years ago, when David and Jessica wanted to buy that massive colonial house in Cincinnati, they couldn't afford it, Patty explained. Jessica's credit was abysmal due to her boutique's early losses, and David didn't have the down payment. So Arthur stepped in, but he refused to hand them cash. He knew Jessica would burn through it. Patty tapped the LLC document with her manicured fingernail. Arthur created Foundation Properties, LLC. The LLC purchased the Cincinnati house. Arthur paid 80% of the home's value in cash as the down payment. The LLC holds the deed. David and Jessica do not own that house, Beatrice. They never have. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood rushed in my ears. Then what are they? They are tenants, Patty said simply. Arthur allowed them to sign a master lease agreement with the LLC. They pay a heavily subsidized below-market rate, just enough to cover the property taxes and the remaining micro-mortgage. David always assumed the property management company he paid every month was just a bank entity Arthur had negotiated with to hide his charity from Jessica's pride. I stared at the paperwork, the charcoal front door, the immaculate hardwood floors, the pristine kitchen where Jessica had shamed me for my beige sweater, the porch where she had violently thrown my suitcase into the snow, screaming that it was her house. Who owns Foundation Properties LLC now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, though I already knew the answer. Patty folded her hands on the desk. The LLC is entirely owned by the Irrevocable Trust, and you are the sole beneficiary of the trust. As of the moment Arthur passed away, the control transferred to you. Beatrice, you own the house. You are their landlord. The silence in the office was absolute. I closed my eyes. I pictured Jessica's furious, contemptuous face on Thanksgiving Day. You are a parasite. Get out of my house. I pictured David, looking at his shoes, handing me a pitiful stack of cash, choosing his own comfort over his mother's survival. They had stripped me of my dignity, my savings, and my family, believing I was entirely powerless. They believed they held all the cards. They had no idea they were sitting at my table. Patty, I said, opening my eyes. The gentle, soulful gaze was gone, replaced by the sheer, unyielding bedrock of a woman reclaiming her life. I need to know exactly what my legal rights are regarding my property, and I need to know how fast we can enforce them. Patty Rollins smiled, a brilliant, predatory smile of an attorney who had just been unleashed. We can enforce them today, Beatrice. Let's get to work. The first thing Patricia Rollins did, before we signed a single legal document, was hand me a checkbook. The trust has over $300,000 in liquid assets, Beatrice, Patty had said. Her voice broker firm, but her eyes kind. Arthur left explicit instructions that if you ever came to me in distress, I was to authorize an immediate disbursement. Take this. Go to the Westin downtown. Get a proper room, order room service, and sleep. We will dismantle your son's delusions tomorrow. I took the checkbook. For the first time in 18 months, my hand didn't tremble when holding a piece of financial paper. That afternoon, I stood under the scalding hot water of a luxury hotel shower until my skin turned pink, physically washing away the smell of the Chevy Malibu, the Walmart parking lot, and the deep, pervasive shame of homelessness. When I stepped out, I didn't put the heavy, freezing khaki jacket back on. Using the funds Patty had released, I had purchased a few new things. I dressed in a fresh, elegant beige silk shirt. It was simple, tailored, and breathed with a quiet sophistication. I brushed my hair, styling it into short, soft curls that framed my face. I wore no jewelry, no pearls, no rings, nothing to distract from the raw reality of who I was. I looked at myself in the floor-to-length mirror. I didn't smile. My facial expression settled into something entirely new. A firm, steely resolve, yet anchored by a gentle, soulful gaze. I was a mother who had survived the ultimate betrayal. I was not plotting revenge. I was simply stepping into the authority that had always belonged to me. The next morning, I walked back into Patty's corner office. The Columbus skyline was bright and clear behind her massive desk, which was now covered in neat stacks of legal folders. You look like a new woman, Beatrice," Patty said, looking up from her reading glasses. "I am the woman Arthur always knew I could be," I replied, taking the leather chair opposite her. "Now tell me how we take back my house." Patty's professional demeanor shifted. The warmth faded, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a litigator who had just found a fatal flaw in the opposing counsel's argument. She slid a thick, blue-bound file toward me. "Taking back the house is straightforward," Patty began, tapping the file. "The master lease Arthur set up for David was a month-to-month agreement, heavily subsidized. They pay $900 a month. The fair market value for a 4-bedroom colonial in that specific Cincinnati zip code is roughly $4,200. The irony of that number, the exact amount David had handed me to vanish from his life, was not lost on me. We simply issue a formal 30-day notice of rent increase to align with current market rates," Patty continued. "When they inevitably fail to pay, we file a standard eviction notice. It's clean, it's legal, and it's entirely by the book." I nodded slowly. "Good, do it." "But," Patty raised a single finger, her eyes darkening, "that is not why I called you in so early this morning. Before drafting the notices, I ran a standard title search on the property to ensure the LLC's standing was clear. Beatrice, your daughter-in-law's greed has absolutely no bounds." She opened the blue file and pulled out a photocopy of a commercial loan application. "This was filed with a secondary high-risk lending firm 3 days ago," Patty said, her voice deadly serious. "Jessica is attempting to secure a $150,000 line of credit for her failing boutique, and she listed the Cincinnati house as the primary collateral." I stared at the paperwork, the letters blurring together. How is that even possible? She doesn't own the house. David doesn't own the house. The LLC does. "Exactly," Patty leaned forward, clasping her hands. "But Jessica and David share the last name Hayes. Arthur's original paperwork for the LLC lists an A. Hayes as the managing director. Jessica has submitted forged documents to this lending firm, claiming that David is the sole owner of Foundation Properties LLC. She forged his signature, and she is attempting to leverage an asset she has absolutely zero legal right to touch." A cold chill ran down my spine. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. While I had been freezing in a Walmart parking lot, eating stale crackers to survive, Jessica had been sitting in my living room, forging documents to gamble my husband's legacy on her bankrupt vanity project. "Does David know?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Whether he knows or not is legally irrelevant at this point," Patty said flatly. "If he signed it, he is complicit in title fraud. If she forged his signature without his knowledge, she is committing a felony. Either way, they are attempting to encumber a property owned by your trust." For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the accommodating, forgiving mother fluttered in my chest. "If this goes to the police, David could go to prison. Tyler will grow up with a felon for a father." I closed my eyes, remembering David looking at the floor while Jessica threw my suitcase into the snow. I remembered him handing me the scraps of my own stolen life savings. He had chosen his path. I was no longer obligated to shield him from the consequences of his cowardice. "Stop the loan, Patty," I said, opening my eyes. The soulful gaze hardened into pure steel. "Contact the lending firm immediately. Inform them that the applicant has no legal authority over Foundation Properties LLC and that any further processing of that application will result in immediate litigation for fraudulent encumbrance." Patty's pen flew across her legal pad. "Done. And the house? I want no loopholes. I want no room for negotiation," I instructed, my voice echoing with a quiet, absolute authority. "Draft the notice of rent increase. Raise it to $4,500 a month, effective in exactly 30 days. Simultaneously, I want you to draft a formal notice to quit for lease violations." Patty looked up, impressed. "Lease violations?" David admitted to me that he used the LLC's property, my property, to run illegal, unpermitted renovations to expand Jessica's walk-in closet last year, I said smoothly, pulling the memory from the endless months I had spent silently observing their lives. He also failed to maintain the HVAC system, resulting in water damage he hid behind drywall. It's all a violation of the standard Ohio lease agreement. Patty smiled, a terrifying, brilliant flash of teeth. You really were paying attention in that house, weren't you? When you are treated like a ghost, I replied softly. You see everything. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously drafting the documents. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. There would be no emotional pleas, no screaming matches in the hallway, no dramatic confrontations. There would only be the devastating, crushing weight of the law, delivered on crisp, watermarked paper. At 11:45 a.m., Patty placed a stack of sealed envelopes on her desk. They were addressed to Mr. David Hayes and Mrs. Jessica Hayes at the Cincinnati address. These will be sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, Patty said, resting her hand on the envelopes. They will have to sign for them at the door. The moment that pen hits the paper, the clock starts. 30 days, Beatrice. I looked at the envelopes. Inside those thin paper walls was the absolute destruction of Jessica's aesthetic empire and David's cowardly delusions. Inside was the justice Arthur had reached from beyond the grave to guarantee. Send them, I said. I walked out of the lawyer's office and stepped onto the busy Columbus street. The winter sun was bright, the air crisp and biting. I pulled my beige coat around my shoulders, but for the first time in over a year, I wasn't cold. The trap had been set. Now all I had to do was wait for the mail carrier to walk up that pristine driveway, knock on that charcoal front door, and hand my daughter-in-law the exact price of her cruelty. The 30 days that followed the delivery of the notices were the most peaceful of my life. I remained at the Westin in Columbus, reading, taking long walks in the crisp winter air, and letting the deep, jagged wounds of the past 18 months begin to heal. Back in Cincinnati, however, I knew a firestorm was raging. Patty Rollins kept me updated. As expected, David and Jessica did not quietly pack their bags. Assuming Foundation Properties LLC was just a faceless, predatory corporate entity that Arthur had used, they hired a mid-level defense attorney to fight the eviction and the rent increase. They filed a dispute, claiming the hike was retaliatory and illegal. They demanded a hearing. They wanted to stand before a judge and play the victims. I gave them exactly what they asked for. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in mid-February at the Hamilton County Courthouse. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening snow, but I felt nothing but a profound, radiant warmth. I dressed with absolute, deliberate care. I wore a tailored beige silk shirt layered under a crisp, structured beige vest. My hair, now styled in short, soft, elegant curls, framed a face that no longer carried the heavy, downward pull of grief. I wore no jewelry, no accessories to distract from the raw truth of the moment. When I looked in the mirror, my expression was firm and steely, yet anchored by a quiet, gentle certainty. I was not walking into that courthouse as a victim seeking revenge. I was walking in as a landlord claiming her rightful property. Patty and I arrived 20 minutes early. We took our seats in the second row of the gallery, blending in with the handful of other people waiting for their civil disputes. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and they walked in. Jessica led the way, practically vibrating with indignant, arrogant energy. She wore a sharp black blazer and designer heels, looking every bit the successful boutique owner she so desperately pretended to be. Behind her walked David. My breath caught for just a fraction of a second. He looked terrible. He had lost weight. His shoulders were rounded, and his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. The stress of impending homelessness and crushing debt had hollowed him out. They didn't look at the gallery. They didn't see me. They walked straight to the petitioner's table and sat down next to their attorney, whispering frantically. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with zero tolerance for nonsense, took the bench. She shuffled through the docket and adjusted her glasses. "Case number 44B," the judge announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Hayes versus Foundation Properties, LLC. Dispute of notice to quit and rent increase. Counsel, proceed." David and Jessica's lawyer, a man whose suit looked slightly too large for him, stood up. He launched into a passionate, rehearsed speech. He painted a tragic picture of a hard-working young family, anchored by a successful local business owner, who were being ruthlessly targeted by a greedy, faceless corporate landlord. He argued that the rent increase from $900 to $4,500 was predatory, sudden, and designed specifically to circumvent eviction moratoriums, Your Honor, my clients have built their lives in this home, their lawyer pleaded, gesturing toward David and Jessica, who had arranged their faces into masks of noble suffering. To throw them out into the winter cold based on a sudden astronomical rent hike by a shadow corporation is an affront to the residential tenancy laws of this state. The judge listened silently, making a few notes. When he finished, she looked over at the respondents' table. Does Counsel for Foundation Properties LLC have a response? Patty Rollins stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her navy suit. The sheer, terrifying competence radiating from her instantly shifted the temperature of the room. We do, Your Honor, Patty said, her voice ringing out crisp and clear. First, I must correct opposing counsel's characterization of my client. Foundation Properties LLC is not a shadow corporation. It is a single-member LLC, fully owned by the Arthur Hayes Irrevocable Trust, and the sole beneficiary and managing director of that LLC is present in the courtroom today. Patty turned and gestured toward the gallery. Mrs. Beatrice Hayes, would you please step forward? I stood up. I stepped out of the wooden pew, my beige silk vest catching the harsh fluorescent light, and walked down the center aisle toward the tables. The click of my low heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the dead-silent courtroom. David turned his head. When his eyes locked onto mine, the physical reaction was so violent I thought he might have a seizure. The color drained from his face so fast it left him looking like a corpse. His jaw dropped, and he gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white. Mom? He choked out. It was a pathetic, breathless squeak. Jessica whipped her head around. For a second, her brain simply could not process the visual information. She looked at the elegant, steely woman walking toward her, trying to reconcile this image with the drab, broken old woman she had thrown into the snow. When the reality finally shattered her cognitive dissonance, her mouth opened in a silent scream of pure horror. I did not look at them. I walked straight past their table, stood next to Patty, and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, Patty continued, ignoring the absolute meltdown happening at the opposing table. My client, Mrs. Beatrice Hayes, is the legal owner of the property. The previous rent of $900 was an informal, heavily subsidized family courtesy extended by her late husband. Upon taking control of the LLC, Mrs. Hayes simply adjusted the rent to fair market value, strictly adhering to the mandated 30-day notice period. This is a lie, Jessica suddenly shrieked, shooting up from her chair, her carefully curated facade disintegrating into hysterical panic. She has nothing. She's a penniless old woman. David's father bought that house for us. Order! The judge slammed her gavel, glaring at Jessica. Sit down, Mrs. Hayes, or I will have the bailiff remove you. Your attorney will speak for you. Jessica sank back into her chair, hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically toward David. But David was paralyzed, staring at me as if I were a ghost holding a loaded gun. Furthermore, Your Honor, Patty said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. The notice to quit was not merely about rent. It was triggered by a severe and potentially criminal breach of the lease agreement. Patty picked up the blue folder from her table and approached the bench, handing a copy to the judge and a copy to the opposing counsel. 3 weeks ago, Jessica Hayes attempted to secure a $150,000 commercial line of credit for her failing retail business. As collateral, she listed the property owned by Foundation Properties LLC. The opposing lawyer looked down at the document Patty had handed him. He visibly flinched. As you can see on page 4, Patty continued, driving the final nail into the coffin, the application requires the signature of the LLC's managing director. Jessica Hayes forged her husband's signature on this document, falsely claiming he was the sole owner of the LLC, in a desperate attempt to illegally encumber my client's property. Twist. The entire courtroom froze. The judge's eyes narrowed as she scrutinized the forged signature. But the real explosion happened at the petitioner's table. David slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The paralyzing shock had vanished, replaced by a dawning, horrific realization. Jess, he whispered, his voice trembling. Did you try to mortgage the house behind my back? Did you forge my name on a federal loan document? Jessica's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She looked trapped, a rat in a corner. I was trying to save the boutique, David. I was trying to save our future. You are so useless, you wouldn't do it yourself. You forged my signature, David yelled, completely forgetting where he was. You committed fraud. You were going to put me in federal prison to save your stupid clothing store. If you were half a man, you would have found the money, she screamed back, her true venomous nature fully exposed for the court record. You let your mother hide this from us. You let her ruin us. Enough. The judge's gavel came down like a thunderclap, silencing the courtroom instantly. The absolute disgust on her face was palpable. She looked at the opposing counsel, who was already packing his briefcase, clearly realizing he had been dragged into a fraudulent mess. Then the judge looked at David and Jessica. I have seen a lot of ugly family disputes in my courtroom, the judge said, her voice vibrating with contempt. But the sheer audacity of this takes the prize. The rent increase is legal. The eviction is lawful. And frankly, considering the evidence of attempted title fraud, you are lucky Mrs. Hayes is only seeking an eviction and not referring this to the district attorney. The judge stamped the file with a heavy, satisfying thud. Judgment in favor of the respondent. The petitioners have 30 days to vacate the premises and are liable for all outstanding market rate rent. Furthermore, I am forwarding this loan application to the fraud division. We are adjourned. Bang. The gavel fell. It was over. Jessica collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically, the reality of her total destruction finally crashing down on her. She had lost the house, her business was dead, and she was facing a criminal investigation. David stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at the woman he had sacrificed his mother for, a woman who had been willing to send him to prison to fund her vanity. Then David looked at me. Tears streamed down his face. His eyes begged for a lifeline. For the mother who had always bailed him out, who had always smoothed over his mistakes. He took a hesitant step toward me. Mom, he choked, reaching out a trembling hand. I looked at my son. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the boy he used to be. But the woman standing in that courtroom had no more blood to bleed for him. I had endured the cold. I had survived the dark. And I had won. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply adjusted the collar of my beige vest, turned my back on the wreckage of their lives, and walked out of the courtroom, into the bright, clear light of my new life. March in Ohio always brings a hesitant, unpredictable spring. The frost clings to the morning grass, but by the afternoon, the sun insists on warming the earth, coaxing the first green shoots from the dark soil. 30 days after this gavel fell in the Hamilton County Courthouse, I pulled my Chevy Malibu into the driveway of the Cincinnati Colonial. The stark charcoal front door was exactly where Jessica had left it, but the locks were brand new. The heavy brass keys in my hand felt like the physical weight of my reclaimed independence. When I swung the door open, the house was empty. They had vacated precisely on the 30th day, forced out by the sheer, unbending reality of the law. Jessica had taken all of her perfectly curated mid-century modern furniture, her expensive diffusers, and her geometric throw pillows. She left nothing behind but the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floors and the echoes of her cruelty. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps ringing out in the silence. It didn't feel lonely. It felt expansive. It felt like a deep, cleansing breath after being held underwater for a year and a half. I didn't try to recreate Jessica's magazine spread aesthetic. I bought a plush, comfortable beige sofa where I could read without worrying about ruining the lines. I bought sturdy wooden spoons for the kitchen. I arranged my spices not by the alphabet, but by how often I used them. I turned the immaculate, sterile house into a home that smelled of baking bread and lived in warmth. But I knew I didn't need a sprawling 4-bedroom house all to myself, and I certainly didn't need to hoard the wealth Arthur had left me. With Patricia Rollins' guidance, we restructured Foundation Properties, LLC. I hired a contractor to formally and legally convert the first floor into a beautiful, accessible duplex apartment. I rented it out to a lovely retired couple, a pair of former public school teachers who spent their evenings playing Scrabble on the porch. The rental income from the duplex, combined with the dividends from Arthur's trust, gave me more money than I could ever spend in my lifetime. So I found a purpose for it. I established a charitable trust called the Hamilton Failsafe, named after the silver pocket watch that had saved my life. We partnered with legal aid clinics across Ohio, providing free, aggressive representation for elderly men and women facing financial elder abuse, eviction, and exploitation by their own families. I sat on the board, reviewing cases, and offering the one thing I had desperately needed in that Walmart parking lot: the promise that they were not invisible, and they were not alone. It was late April on a Saturday afternoon bathed in golden sunlight when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find David standing on the porch. He looked older, weathered by the storms of his own making. The divorce with Jessica had been brutal, swift, and absolute. Once the boutique collapsed and the fraud investigation began, she had turned on him entirely, eventually fleeing to her sister's house in California to escape the creditors. David had managed to secure shared custody of Tyler, but the financial wreckage left him renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the highway, working 50 hours a week in a logistics warehouse to pay off the debts his wife had accumulated. He stood there, holding his hands awkwardly in his pockets, looking at the door I had recently repainted a cheerful, welcoming red. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. His voice lacked the smooth, confident polish it used to have. It was gravelly, humbled. "Hello, David," I replied. I didn't invite him inside immediately. I let the boundary stand between us for a moment. "Come around to the back. I made iced tea." We sat on the wooden patio furniture I had bought for the backyard. The garden was beginning to bloom. The hydrangeas Arthur had loved so much were already showing bright green buds. David stared at his glass, tracing the condensation with his thumb. We sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't the suffocating, tense silence of the past year. It was the quiet of a battlefield long after the war had ended. "I brought Tyler's soccer schedule," David finally said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "He has a game next Saturday at noon. He asked if you would come." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, taking the paper and setting it on the table. David swallowed hard. He looked out at the garden, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm in therapy, Mom, trying to figure out how I became a man who could watch his mother be thrown into the snow and do nothing. My therapist says I used you as a human shield because you were safe, and Jessica wasn't." He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were clear, carrying the heavy, exhausted weight of genuine remorse. "It doesn't fix it," he said, his voice breaking. "I know saying sorry doesn't buy back the money I wasted or the nights you spent in your car, but I am so incredibly sorry. I was a coward, and I am paying for it every single day." I looked at my son. The anger that had burned so cold and bright inside me for months had finally gone out, leaving behind a calm, peaceful ash. "I forgive you, Davy," I said quietly. He let out a shuddering breath, a tear slipping down his cheek. "But," I continued, my voice firm, completely devoid of the old accommodating softness, "forgiveness is not a blank check. I will come to Tyler's games. You can bring him here on Sundays for dinner. We will be a family. But I will not pay your debts. I will not co-sign your lease. And you will never, ever have a key to my house again." David nodded slowly, wiping his face. "I know, Mom. I wouldn't ask you to. I have to rebuild this myself." "Yes," I agreed. "You do." We finished our tea. When he left, he hugged me. A tentative, respectful embrace, honoring the fortress I had built around myself. I watched him drive away in his rusted sedan, feeling a profound sense of closure. If you have listened to my story this far, I want to leave you with a truth I paid a terrible price to learn. If you are a woman who has spent her life in the quiet, invisible work of care, raising children, supporting a husband, maintaining a home, do not ever let anyone tell you that your contributions hold no value. Love is not a reason to surrender your autonomy. Trust is not a substitute for legal protection. Keep your name on your accounts. Keep your name on your deed. Do not sign away your power for the promise of a quiet life, because a life without power is just a waiting room for someone else's convenience. You are not a burden. You are not a piece of outdated furniture. You are a human being who has earned the right to stand firmly on the ground you helped build. I am Beatrice Hayes. I am 68 years old. I survived the darkest, coldest winter of my life, not because I was lucky, but because a man who loved me handed me a key, and I finally had the courage to turn the lock. I picked up my watering can and walked out into the warm spring sun. Arthur always said an engineer builds a failsafe for the worst-case scenario. But as I watered the emerging hydrangeas, I smiled. An engineer builds for disaster, but a gardener plants for the next season. The winter was finally over, and my garden was just beginning to bloom.